The attic storeroom should have been empty that October evening in 1845. The door had been sealed with brick and mortar 3 decades earlier. No entrance, no exit, just solid wall where a threshold once stood. Yet there it was, a lantern flame dancing behind the dusty glass window, casting shadows that moved like living things across the ceiling beams. Elias Foster had been working in that very attic just hours before, sorting through old ledgers and forgotten crates of china. Now he was gone, vanished without a trace, but the light he supposedly left burning continued to glow with an intensity that defied explanation. For 2 full nights, that impossible flame flickered in a room that couldn't be entered, a room that shouldn't exist, while the entire household whispered questions they were too afraid to answer. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning Elias Foster arrived at the Pemberton estate on the eastern edge of Savannah, the magnolia trees were shedding their last blooms onto the cobblestone drive. He was 27 years old, tall and lean, with hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime of labor. Though his eyes carried something else entirely, a sharp intelligence that made the overseers uncomfortable. Master Harrison Pemberton had purchased him at auction specifically for his literacy, a rare commodity among the enslaved, and one that the aging plantation owner needed for organizing the chaos of paperwork that had accumulated in his family manor over generations. The Pemberton house was a towering structure of red brick and white columns, built in 1798 by Harrison's grandfather, a shipping magnate who had made his fortune in the cotton trade. 3 stories rose above the manicured grounds, topped by an attic space that ran the entire length of the building. It was this attic that became Elias's primary domain, a dusty realm of forgotten furniture, trunks filled with correspondence dating back half a century, and room after room of items that the Pemberton family had simply abandoned to time and cobwebs. On his 3rd day of work, Elias discovered something peculiar. While cataloging the contents of the eastern wing of the attic, he noticed an architectural inconsistency. The exterior wall, visible through a grimy window, showed a slight protrusion, a bump in the otherwise smooth facade that suggested additional space beyond what the interior layout revealed. He measured his steps carefully, counting the distance from the stairwell to the far wall, then went outside and did the same along the building's exterior. There was a discrepancy of approximately 12 feet. That evening, as the October sun painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Elias mentioned his observation to Solomon, an older man who had worked the Pemberton grounds for 40 years. They stood together near the kitchen house, where Solomon tended a small fire for smoking meat. The old man's face darkened when Elias described what he had found. "Don't go poking around that eastern section," Solomon said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "That room been sealed up since before I came here. Master Harrison's father did it back in 1815 or thereabouts. Ain't nobody been in there since, and for good reason." Elias felt curiosity stirring in his chest. That same restless need to understand that had gotten him in trouble more than once in his previous situations. What reason would that be? Solomon glanced toward the main house, ensuring they were alone. Harrison's younger brother, a boy named William, he disappeared from that room. They found it locked from the inside, but the boy was gone. Searched everywhere, tore the place apart, looking for secret passages or hiding spots. Never found nothing. Master Harrison's father, old Cornelius Pemberton, he went half mad with grief. Had the doorway bricked up, sealed it so nobody could ever go in there again. Said it was cursed. Said something in that room took his boy. The story should have been enough to satisfy Elias's curiosity, perhaps even enough to discourage further investigation. Instead, it ignited something in him, a burning need to understand what had really happened in that sealed space. Over the following weeks, as he continued his work sorting through decades of Pemberton family history, he found himself returning again and again to that eastern wall, running his hands along the plaster, searching for any sign of the doorway that had once existed. Master Harrison Pemberton was a man of failing health and fading authority. At 63 years old, his body had been ravaged by consumption, and he spent most of his days in his ground-floor study coughing into handkerchiefs that his wife, Margaret, would quietly take away and burn. He rarely ventured to the upper floors anymore, and the attic had become Elias's kingdom by default. The overseers, two brutish men named Calhoun and Briggs, concerned themselves primarily with the field hands who worked the small tobacco plot on the southern edge of the property. Elias, with his specialized indoor duties, was largely left to his own devices. This freedom allowed him to pursue his investigation with increasing boldness. He discovered, tucked away in a trunk of old correspondence, architectural drawings of the house as it had been originally constructed. The sealed room, according to these yellowed documents, had been designed as a study for Cornelius Pemberton's personal use. The drawings showed a modest space, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a single window facing east and a door that opened into the main attic corridor. Nothing about the room's design suggested anything unusual, no hidden chambers, no peculiar features that might explain a child's disappearance. Yet William Pemberton had vanished from that room in 1815 when he was just 9 years old. Elias found references to the incident in several letters that Margaret Pemberton's mother had written to relatives in Charleston. The accounts were fragmentary and often contradictory, but certain details appeared consistently. William had gone to the room to retrieve a book on the afternoon of November 3rd. When he failed to return for supper, the family went looking for him. They found the door locked from the inside, the key turned in the mechanism. When they finally broke down the door, the room was empty. The window was closed and latched from within. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where the boy might have gone. The search had lasted for weeks. Cornelius Pemberton had hired investigators from as far away as Atlanta. They had examined every inch of the room, testing the floorboards for hollow spaces, checking the walls for hidden passages, even examining the chimney flue that connected to the room's small fireplace. Nothing was found. William Pemberton had simply ceased to exist, as thoroughly as if he had never been born. In the months following the disappearance, Cornelius began to lose his grip on sanity. According to the letters Elias read, the old man became convinced that something supernatural inhabited the room. He claimed to hear sounds coming from behind the bricked-up doorway, scratching noises and faint cries that might have been a child's voice. In 1816, less than a year after sealing the room, Cornelius died in his sleep. His physician attributed the death to a heart weakened by stress and grief. But household servants at the time whispered that he had been frightened to death by whatever dwelt in that cursed space. Elias found these accounts fascinating, not because he believed in curses or supernatural forces, but because he recognized the hallmarks of a mystery that had never been properly investigated. The people involved had been too quick to embrace the explanation of otherworldly intervention, and in doing so, they had abandoned any attempt at rational inquiry. He became determined to solve the puzzle that had defeated Cornelius Pemberton's investigators 30 years earlier. His opportunity came in late October during a week when the Pemberton family traveled to Charleston for the wedding of a distant cousin. Master Harrison, despite his illness, felt obligated to attend, and he brought his wife and 2 daughters along with him. The overseers remained behind, but they had little interest in what transpired in the manor's upper reaches. Elias knew he would have several days of virtually unsupervised access to the attic. On the first evening after the family's departure, he brought his tools to the eastern wall. He had fashioned a makeshift pry bar from a piece of iron he found in the carriage house, and he had borrowed a hammer from the workshop behind the stables. The wall that sealed the old doorway was constructed of brick covered with several layers of plaster, paint, and wallpaper. He began carefully, not wanting to create more damage than necessary, but as he worked, he found himself becoming almost frantic with anticipation. The plaster came away in chunks, revealing the brickwork beneath. These bricks were different from those used in the main structure, newer and more roughly laid, clearly the work of someone who valued speed over craftsmanship. Elias worked by lantern light, and the shadows his movements cast seemed to dance with an almost malevolent energy. By midnight, he had created a hole large enough to peer through. He held the lantern up to the opening, its flame guttering slightly in the draft that came from the sealed space beyond. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The room was exactly as it had been described in the architectural drawings, a modest study with a single window, a small fireplace, and walls lined with built-in shelves. But it was not empty. Furniture remained in place, a desk, a chair, and several stacks of books that appeared to have been left exactly where someone had set them down decades ago. Dust covered everything in a thick blanket, and cobwebs stretched from corner to corner in elaborate patterns. And there, in the center of the room, sat another lantern. Elias felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the October night. The lantern in the sealed room was old-fashioned, a style that had been common 30 years earlier, with a brass base and glass chimney. It sat on the desk, unlit and covered in the same thick dust that coated everything else. He stared at it for a long moment, trying to understand why the sight of this ordinary object filled him with such profound unease. He continued his work, removing bricks one by one until he had created an opening large enough to climb through. The gap looked like a wound in the wall, jagged and dark, and as Elias stood before it, he felt a momentary hesitation. Solomon's warnings echoed in his mind, and he found himself thinking about Cornelius Pemberton's descent into madness. But curiosity was stronger than fear, and the need to understand what had happened in this room 3 decades ago overcame his misgivings. Before entering, Elias paused to consider the full weight of what he was doing. He was not merely breaking into a forbidden space, he was defying the unspoken rules that governed every aspect of his existence as an enslaved man. His life was not his own, not in any legal or practical sense. Every moment of his day belonged to the Pemberton family. Every skill he possessed was their property to use as they saw fit. The few hours he spent sleeping in his cabin were a concession, not a right, and even those could be taken from him at any moment if his owners desired it. Yet here he stood, about to pursue knowledge purely for his own sake, driven by intellectual curiosity that served no master's purpose. It was an act of rebellion, small, perhaps, in the grand scheme of human resistance, but profound in its assertion that his mind remained his own. Whatever happened in that sealed room, whatever truths or horrors he discovered, they would belong to him in a way that nothing else in his life could. This thought gave him courage, and he gripped his lantern more firmly as he prepared to enter. The weight of history pressed upon him as well. He thought about all the enslaved people who had lived and died on this property over the decades, their stories untold, their sufferings unrecorded except in the ledgers that tracked them as property. How many of them had harbored secret knowledge, pursued private investigations, nurtured intellectual lives that their owners never suspected. The very fact that he could read and write set him apart, made him valuable in ways that most enslaved people could never be. But it also isolated him. Solomon and the others could not fully understand his need to solve this mystery because they had never tasted the particular intoxication of pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Elias had learned to read in secret, taught by an elderly woman who had been freed by her owner's will and who spent her final years running a clandestine school in the back room of a tavern that catered to free black people. He had been 11 years old, passed from owner to owner after his mother died of fever, and that school had been his salvation. For 2 years, before he was sold again and sent further south, he had spent every spare moment learning letters, devouring every book and newspaper he could find, building a foundation of knowledge that subsequent owners had found valuable enough to exploit rather than suppress. But literacy was a dangerous gift for an enslaved person. It opened worlds that were supposed to remain closed, created desires that could never be safely fulfilled. Every book Elias read reminded him of the vast scope of human knowledge and achievement that existed beyond the narrow confines of his bondage. Every newspaper article about distant places and momentous events emphasized how small his own life was, how circumscribed by forces beyond his control. And every letter he read or wrote for his owners revealed the casual cruelty with which people like him were bought, sold, and disposed of, reduced to entries in account books valued by the pound like tobacco or cotton. The sealed room represented something different. Here was a mystery that transcended the daily brutalities of slavery, a puzzle that existed in a realm where the categories of free and enslaved meant nothing. Whatever had happened to William Pemberton, it had nothing to do with the color of his skin or his position in society. It was simply a human tragedy, wrapped in questions that demanded answers. In investigating it, Elias could, for a few hours at least, exist as simply a mind seeking truth, rather than as property seeking to please its owner. He took his lantern and climbed through the opening, his feet landing on floorboards that creaked under his weight. The air in the sealed room was stale and thick, carrying odors of must and decay that spoke of long years without circulation. Elias stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness beyond his lantern's glow. The room felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate, as if the space itself resented his intrusion. He began to explore methodically, examining the desk first. Its surface was covered with papers that crumbled at his touch. Documents so old and dry that they disintegrated into powder at the slightest contact. He could make out a few words here and there, fragments of business correspondence that Cornelius Pemberton had apparently been working on when his son disappeared. There was an account book, its pages filled with neat columns of figures that tracked cotton shipments and warehouse inventories. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested any dark purpose or hidden secret. The books on the shelves were a mix of volumes, treatises on agriculture, books of poetry, a Bible bound in cracked leather, several novels that had been popular in the late 1700s. Elias pulled one down and opened it carefully. On the inside cover, written in a child's careful hand, was a name and date, William Pemberton, December 1814. He was touching something the vanished boy had once held, and the realization sent another chill through him. The fireplace yielded nothing of interest. Its interior was black with old soot, and when Elias examined the flue, he found it barely wider than his arm, far too narrow for even a child to have used as an escape route. The window was similarly unhelpful. It was closed and latched from the inside, just as the historical accounts had described, and when he tried to open it, he found the mechanism frozen with rust and age. Even if it could be opened, the drop to the ground below was at least 40 feet, and there were no convenient ledges or nearby trees that might have facilitated a climb. He returned to the desk and the old lantern that sat upon it. Picking it up carefully, he examined it in the light of his own lamp. The brass was tarnished green with age, and the glass chimney was cloudy with dust. But otherwise, the object appeared functional. There was still oil in its reservoir. He could hear it sloshing when he tilted the lantern gently. On impulse, he used a match from his pocket to light it. The flame caught immediately, burning with surprising brightness. Elias set the old lantern back on the desk and stepped back, studying the way its light filled the room. The shadows it cast were somehow different from those created by his own lamp, deeper and more absolute, as if this particular light consumed darkness rather than dispelling it. He found himself staring at the pattern of light and shadow on the far wall, where the flickering flame created shapes that almost seemed to form images, figures and faces that appeared and vanished too quickly to be clearly seen. He shook his head, frustrated with his own imagination. There was nothing supernatural about this room, nothing that couldn't be explained by natural causes. A boy had disappeared, yes, but children ran away all the time, especially in households where discipline was harsh. William Pemberton had probably found some way out that the investigators had missed, perhaps a loose floorboard leading to a space between floors or some other architectural quirk that had gone unnoticed. The family's subsequent embrace of supernatural explanations was simply the result of grief and the human need to find meaning in tragedy. And yet, as Elias stood in that sealed room with 2 lanterns burning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation was so strong that he found himself turning repeatedly, checking the corners and shadows, expecting to find someone standing behind him. Each time, he found nothing but dust and cobwebs and the accumulated detritus of 3 decades of isolation. He decided to conduct a thorough search of the floor, testing each board for hollow spaces beneath. He started in one corner and worked his way systematically across the room, pressing down on each plank, listening for the telltale sound of emptiness below. Most of the boards were solid, their groaning protests merely the complaint of old wood under new weight. But near the center of the room, directly in front of the desk, he found something different. One section of flooring, perhaps 3 feet square, sounded distinctly hollow when he rapped his knuckles against it. Elias felt his pulse quicken as he examined the boards more closely. They appeared to be the same as all the others, the same width, the same worn finish. But when he looked carefully at the joints, he noticed something peculiar. The nails holding these particular boards in place were slightly different from the others, newer perhaps, or driven in at angles that suggested they had been removed and replaced. He used his makeshift pry bar to work at the edge of one board, applying steady pressure until he heard the groan of nails pulling free from joists. The board came up with a sound like a sigh, revealing darkness beneath. Elias positioned his lantern to shine down into the gap he had created, and what he saw made his hands begin to tremble. Below the floor was a small chamber, perhaps 4 feet deep and roughly the same dimensions as the section of removable boards. It was clearly a hiding space constructed with care and purpose. The walls of the little chamber were lined with tin, and at the bottom lay several objects that gleamed dully in the lantern light. Elias removed the remaining loose boards and lowered himself into the space, his feet finding solid ground on what he realized was the ceiling of the room below. The objects in the chamber were carefully arranged, almost reverently placed. There were several leather-bound journals, a small wooden box with brass fittings, and a stack of papers tied with ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. Elias picked up one of the journals and opened it, tilting the pages to catch the light from above. The handwriting was elegant and flowing, clearly that of an educated person, but the content was disturbing. The journal appeared to be some kind of record of experiments, though the nature of these experiments was not immediately clear. There were detailed descriptions of preparations, lists of materials and ingredients, carefully drawn diagrams that looked like geometric patterns or perhaps magical symbols. As Elias read further, he began to understand what he was looking at. Cornelius Pemberton had been obsessed with the occult. These journals documented years of study into what he called the hidden sciences, practices that most people would have dismissed as witchcraft or demonic conjuration. He had been particularly interested in something he referred to as translocation, the ability to move physical matter from one place to another through means that transcended normal space. The journals were filled with references to obscure texts, experiments that had failed or produced ambiguous results, and a growing sense of frustration that the author was missing some crucial element in his understanding. The most recent entries in the journal, dated from 1814 and early 1815, showed a man becoming increasingly desperate and unhinged. Cornelius wrote about sacrifices that might be necessary, about the possibility that certain transitions required a living catalyst, about his growing certainty that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. The final entry, dated November 2nd, 1815, was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. "Tomorrow I will attempt the working," Cornelius had written. "All preparations are complete. The boy has been instructed to come to the study at the appointed hour. He knows nothing of the true purpose, believes only that I wish to show him a curiosity from my travels. If my calculations are correct, the translocation will occur precisely as the clock strikes 3. I have chosen the garden shed as the destination point, as it provides the necessary solitude for observation without risk of discovery. Should the working succeed, I will have demonstrated the fundamental principles that have eluded me for so many years. Should it fail, I will know that I have erred in my understanding of the necessary geometries. And I must begin again with revised assumptions." Elias sat back on his heels, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just read. Cornelius Pemberton had not been the grieving father that history remembered. He had been a man willing to use his own son as a test subject in dangerous experiments with forces he didn't fully understand. And something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. William had disappeared, yes, but not in the way anyone had suspected. His own father had caused his vanishing, had attempted to magically transport the boy from this room to another location, and had lost him somewhere in the process. The subsequent investigation, the bricking up of the room, Cornelius's descent into madness, all of it took on new meaning in light of this revelation. The old man hadn't been driven mad by supernatural forces or by grief. He had been destroyed by guilt, by the knowledge that his arrogance and obsession had cost him his son. He had sealed the room not to contain some evil presence, but to hide the evidence of his own crime, to ensure that no one would find these journals and discover what he had done. Elias gathered up the journals and papers, intending to examine them more thoroughly. As he climbed back up into the room proper, he noticed that the old lantern on the desk seemed to be burning more brightly than before. The flame had grown taller, and it flickered with an odd intensity that didn't match the still air of the sealed space. He told himself it was simply a trick of the oil, perhaps some change in the fuel as it heated, but the sight made him uneasy nonetheless. He spent the next several hours reading through the journals in more detail, piecing together the full story of Cornelius Pemberton's obsession. The man had begun his occult studies in his youth, during a period he spent in London in the 1760s. He had fallen in with a circle of wealthy men who dabbled in what they called natural magic, practices that claimed to harness invisible forces through ritual and symbol. Most of these men had treated it as an amusing diversion, a way to feel sophisticated and worldly, but Cornelius had taken it seriously. He had spent enormous sums acquiring rare books and manuscripts, had corresponded with practitioners across Europe and even in the Orient, and had gradually assembled what he believed was a coherent system of magical practice. His particular interest in translocation seemed to stem from an incident he witnessed in 1773, when he claimed to have seen a street performer in Paris make a dove disappear from one box and reappear in another across the room. While others assumed this was merely clever sleight of hand, Cornelius became convinced that the performer had access to genuine magical knowledge. He had spent the next 40 years trying to replicate what he believed he had witnessed, working through countless theories and experimental designs, all in pursuit of the ability to move matter instantaneously across space. By the time William was born in 1806, Cornelius was already deeply immersed in his studies. The journals suggested that he viewed his son not primarily as a child to be loved and raised, but as a potential subject for his experiments. There were entries that discussed the possibility that youth and innocence might serve as important factors in successful magical workings, that the uncorrupted essence of a child might be more receptive to translocation than the fixed and rigid nature of adult matter. The working he attempted on November 3, 1815, was the culmination of years of preparation. He had calculated what he believed were the optimal conditions: time of day, planetary alignments, geometric arrangements of objects in the room, and specific verbal formulas that needed to be recited. William was instructed to stand in the center of a chalk circle that his father had drawn on the floor, to hold a particular crystal in his hands, and to remain absolutely still while Cornelius performed the ritual. What happened then was never fully documented because Cornelius's journals ended with that final entry on November 2nd. But Elias could imagine the scene. The boy standing in his circle, confused and perhaps frightened by his father's strange behavior. Cornelius reading from his books, making his gestures, believing with absolute certainty that he was about to achieve the impossible. And then, something. A moment when reality bent or broke or simply failed to follow its normal rules. William vanishing, not transported to the garden shed as intended, but lost somewhere else. Somewhere Cornelius's limited understanding couldn't reach or comprehend. Elias looked up from the journals and realized that hours had passed. The old lantern on the desk was still burning, its flame steady and bright. His own lantern, by contrast, was beginning to gutter, its oil running low. He should leave, should take these journals and seal the room back up, should perhaps find some way to bring this information to light so that the truth about William Pemberton's fate could finally be known. But he found himself reluctant to go. The room had become familiar over the course of the night, and despite its dark history, he felt a strange sense of peace here. It was a space apart from the world, sealed away from the concerns and cruelties of daily life. In this room he was not a slave, not property to be bought and sold, but simply a man seeking truth. The feeling was intoxicating, and he wanted to hold on to it for as long as possible. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the night. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. He could see the grounds of the estate spreading out below, the formal gardens with their geometric paths, the slave quarters clustered near the tobacco fields, the road that led away towards Savannah proper. From up here, everything looked small and distant, like a landscape painted on canvas rather than a world he actually inhabited. As he stood there, he became aware of a strange sensation, a tingling in his skin that seemed to emanate from the center of the room behind him. He turned and saw that the old lantern's flame had changed. It was no longer yellow and orange, but had taken on a bluish tinge, and it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost like a heartbeat. The air around the lantern was shimmering, as if heat were rising from it, though Elias could feel no increase in temperature. He approached the desk slowly, his eyes fixed on the impossible flame. As he drew closer, he began to hear something, a sound so faint that it might have been imagination, but it seemed to be coming from the lantern itself. It was like wind through distant trees, or perhaps like voices heard from very far away, words that were just below the threshold of understanding. Elias reached out, his hand moving almost of its own accord, and touched the brass base of the lantern. The moment his skin made contact with the metal, the world lurched. The room seemed to tilt and spin, though he knew he was standing still. The walls appeared to become translucent, and through them he could see other spaces, other rooms that existed somehow adjacent to this one. He saw the garden shed that Cornelius had designated as William's intended destination, empty and dark. He saw the main floor of the house where servants were beginning to stir and prepare for the day. He saw the slave quarters where men and women were waking to face another day of labor. And he saw something else, something that shouldn't exist. Another room, or perhaps the same room but different, occupied by a figure he recognized from the portrait that hung in the downstairs hall. William Pemberton, still 9 years old, still wearing the clothes he had worn on the day of his disappearance, standing in a space that was and wasn't the sealed study. The boy looked directly at Elias, his eyes wide with an expression that might have been hope or terror or both. Elias tried to pull his hand away from the lantern, but found he couldn't move. His muscles had locked, and he was frozen in place, one hand on the brass base, his body caught in a moment that seemed to stretch and extend into infinity. He could feel himself being pulled in multiple directions at once, as if his very essence were being divided and scattered across the overlapping spaces he had glimpsed. Terror flooded through him, and he understood with sudden clarity what had happened to William Pemberton 30 years ago. Cornelius's ritual had worked in a fashion, but not in the way he intended. It had created a kind of tear in the fabric of space, a wound that connected this room to other places, other moments. William had not been transported to the garden shed. He had been pulled into that in-between space, trapped in a liminal realm where normal rules of existence didn't apply. He had been there for 30 years, if time even had meaning in such a place, waiting for someone to open the door that would bring him back. And now Elias had done exactly what William had done. He had touched the lantern while it burned with that strange blue flame, and he was being drawn into the same trap that had claimed the boy 3 decades earlier. With an effort that felt like it might tear him apart, Elias wrenched his hand away from the lantern. The room snapped back into its normal state, solid and definite, though he could feel that something fundamental had changed. He stumbled backward, his legs weak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The lantern's flame had returned to its normal yellow color, but it still burned with that peculiar brightness that seemed to defy natural law. He grabbed his own lantern and the journals, suddenly desperate to leave the sealed room. As he climbed through the opening he had made in the wall, he glanced back one last time. The old lantern sat on the desk, its flame dancing gently, and in the shadows around it, Elias thought he saw movement. Figures shifting in the darkness, reaching out with hands that might have been William's or might have been something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in that liminal space for even longer than the vanished boy. He emerged into the main attic and immediately began replacing the bricks he had removed. His hands shook as he worked, mixing mortar with trembling fingers, desperate to seal the opening before something could follow him out. By the time the sun had fully risen, he had restored the wall to something approximating its former state, though anyone who looked closely would be able to see that the work was fresh and crude compared to the original. For the rest of that day, Elias tried to convince himself that what he had experienced had been some kind of hallucination, perhaps caused by breathing the stale air of the sealed room or by the psychological stress of his investigation. But when evening came and he stood in his small cabin in the slave quarters, he could still feel the pull of that place. The sensation of being caught between spaces hadn't entirely faded. He could sense the sealed room calling to him, could feel the presence of those trapped figures reaching out across the distance that separated them. He tried to sleep but found it impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw William Pemberton's face, saw that expression of desperate hope. The boy had been trapped for 30 years, alone in a space where time and distance had no meaning. And now there was someone who knew he was there, someone who might be able to help him. The moral weight of this knowledge was crushing. How could Elias return to his normal duties, sorting papers and cataloging old furniture, while a child remained lost in that terrible in-between place? But what could he do? He was a slave, property without rights or authority. If he tried to tell anyone what he had discovered, he would be dismissed as superstitious or worse, accused of making up stories to cause trouble. The Pemberton family would never believe that their revered patriarch had been responsible for William's disappearance. They would more likely assume that Elias himself had done something wrong. Perhaps stolen valuables from the sealed room, and he would be punished severely. The following day, the Pemberton family returned from Charleston. Master Harrison looked even more frail than before, and he took to his bed immediately upon arriving home. Elias resumed his regular duties, working in the attic as if nothing had changed, but he found it impossible to concentrate. His eyes kept drifting to the eastern wall, to the place where he knew the old lantern still burned in that sealed space. Days passed, then a week. Elias tried to stay away from the eastern section of the attic, but he found himself drawn there repeatedly. Each time he would stand before the bricked-up doorway, his ear pressed against the wall, listening. Sometimes he thought he could hear sounds from within, the crackle of the lantern's flame, or perhaps the whisper of voices too distant to understand. Other times there was only silence, and he would tell himself that he had imagined everything, that the journals had been elaborate fiction, and his experience in the room had been nothing more than a vivid dream. But he knew the truth. He had touched something that existed beyond normal reality, had glimpsed a realm where Cornelius Pemberton's crude understanding of magic had created a genuine rupture in the fabric of space, and William Pemberton was still there, trapped and waiting. On the night of October 31st, 1845, exactly 30 years and 28 days after William's disappearance, Elias made his decision. He would return to the sealed room. He would light the old lantern again and attempt to bring William back. He didn't know how he would accomplish this, didn't understand the forces he would be dealing with, but he couldn't live with the knowledge of a trapped child without at least trying to help. He waited until the household was asleep, then made his way to the attic with his tools and a fresh lantern. The removal of the bricks went faster this time, as he had already weakened the wall during his first intrusion. Within an hour, he had created an opening large enough to pass through. He took a deep breath, said a quiet prayer to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, and climbed into the sealed room. The old lantern was still on the desk, exactly where he had left it, and to his shock, it was still burning. 10 days had passed since he had lit it. 10 days without any possibility of someone refilling its reservoir or trimming its wick. Yet the flame continued to dance with that same steady brightness. The impossible nature of this observation should have filled him with terror. But instead, Elias felt a strange calm settle over him. This was proof, if any was needed, that something beyond natural law was at work in this place. He set his own lantern down and approached the desk slowly. This time he noticed things he had missed during his first visit. The chalk circle that Cornelius had drawn on the floor was still visible, though faint, its geometric precision speaking to hours of careful preparation. The crystal that William had held, mentioned in the journals, lay on the desk beside the lantern, a multifaceted stone that caught and reflected the light in complex patterns. Elias picked up the crystal, feeling its weight in his palm. It was cool to the touch and slightly irregular, as if it were a natural formation rather than something cut and polished by human hands. As he held it, he became aware of a vibration, a barely perceptible hum that seemed to resonate through his bones. The stone was somehow attuned to the energies that suffused this room, amplifying or focusing them in ways he couldn't begin to understand. He stood in the center of the chalk circle, the same spot where William had stood 30 years ago, and he held the crystal up to the lantern's light. The flame seemed to respond, growing brighter and taking on that eerie blue tinge he had seen before. The air around him began to shimmer, and once again he felt the world starting to slip and shift. But this time, Elias didn't fight it. He surrendered to the sensation, allowing himself to be pulled into that space between spaces. The room around him became transparent, and he could see multiple versions of it overlapping, existing simultaneously in different states. There was the room as it had been in 1815, with fresh paint on the walls and new books on the shelves. There was the room as it was now, covered in dust and cobwebs. And there was another version, the liminal room where William waited. Elias stepped forward, or perhaps sideways, moving in a direction that had no name in normal geometry. He found himself in a space that looked similar to the sealed room but subtly wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the angles not quite right, and the light came from no identifiable source but seemed to emanate from the air itself. And there, standing by the window, was William Pemberton. The boy looked exactly as he had in the portrait downstairs, 9 years old with dark hair and serious eyes. He was dressed in the clothes of 1815, and his face held an expression of infinite weariness. When he saw Elias, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "Are you real?" William asked, his voice thin and distant, as if it were traveling across vast spaces to reach Elias's ears. "I think so," Elias replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. "I came to help you." William took a step forward, and Elias could see that the boy was not quite solid. He had a translucent quality, as if he were made of mist or memory rather than flesh and bone. "I've been here so long," William said. "Time doesn't work right in this place. Sometimes it feels like minutes, sometimes like centuries. I can see out into the real room, but I can't reach it. I can't make anyone hear me." "Your father did this to you," Elias said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "He was trying to perform some kind of magical transport, and it went wrong." William nodded, and Elias saw tears forming in the boy's translucent eyes. "I know. I figured it out eventually. I was so angry at first, but the anger faded. Everything fades here. Emotion, memory, even the sense of being a person. If you stay too long, you forget you were ever anything else." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "How do I get you out?" "I don't know," William admitted. "I've tried everything I could think of. I've tried to follow other people when they come to the regular room, but I can never quite cross over. It's like there's a barrier I can't penetrate. The only time it felt different was when you touched the lantern the first time. For a moment I thought I might be able to reach through, but then you pulled away." Elias looked down at the crystal still clutched in his hand. An idea was forming, dangerous and probably foolish, but it was the only thing he could think of. "If I bring you something from the real world, something that belongs there completely, could you use it as an anchor? Could you follow it back?" William's face brightened with the first real hope Elias had seen. "Maybe. I don't know, but it's worth trying. What did you have in mind?" "Me," Elias said simply. "I'll go back, but I'll keep one hand on the crystal and one hand on the lantern in the real room. You hold on to me here, and when I pull back, you come with me." "That could trap you here instead," William warned. "Or it could trap us both or tear you apart between the worlds. My father didn't understand what he was doing, and neither do we. This is incredibly dangerous." Elias smiled grimly. "I'm a slave in 1845. Every day of my life is dangerous. At least this risk means something." He turned and began walking back toward the version of the sealed room that corresponded to reality. The journey was disorienting, a movement through space that didn't follow normal rules of distance or direction. He could feel William following behind him, the boy's translucent hand gripping his shoulder. They moved through layers of existence, through versions of the room that had never quite been, and others that might yet be, until finally Elias felt solid floorboards beneath his feet and saw his own lantern burning with its normal yellow flame. But he wasn't quite back. He existed in both places simultaneously, standing in the real room while also remaining connected to that liminal space where William drifted. The strain of maintaining this dual existence was enormous. He could feel himself being pulled in multiple directions, his consciousness fragmenting under the impossible burden. He placed the crystal on the desk next to the old lantern, then put one hand on each object. The moment he made contact with both, energy surged through him. The lantern's flame shot upward, filling the room with blue light, and the crystal began to vibrate so violently that he could barely hold on to it. Behind him, he felt William's presence growing stronger, the boy becoming more solid as he used Elias as a bridge between worlds. But something else was happening too. The rupture that Cornelius had created 30 years ago was widening. Elias could feel other presences gathering in that in-between space, things that had been drawn to the tear in reality, and had been waiting for just such an opportunity to cross over. They pressed against the barrier, hungry and desperate, and Elias realized with horror that if he succeeded in bringing William back, he might also release these other entities into the world. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it immediately. Pull William through and risk unleashing unknown horrors, or abandon the boy and ensure that the rupture remained sealed. Every moral instinct in him screamed to save the child, but the rational part of his mind recognized that doing so might endanger countless others. The decision was taken from him. William, seeing the danger, made a choice of his own. The boy's translucent hands pushed Elias forward, forcing him fully back into the real world, while William remained behind. "Seal it," the boy's voice echoed from that impossible distance. "Don't let them through. I've been here 30 years. I can endure eternity if I have to. But don't let those things into your world." Elias wanted to protest, wanted to argue that no one deserved to be sacrificed like this, but William was right. He could feel the malevolent hunger of those other presences, could sense that they were ancient and twisted and utterly inimical to human life. If they crossed over, the consequences would be catastrophic. With a cry of anguish and frustration, Elias released both the crystal and the lantern. The blue light vanished instantly, and he was thrown backward by a force that felt like a physical blow. He hit the far wall and slid to the floor, gasping for breath, his body aching as if he had been beaten. The old lantern's flame had returned to its normal color, but it burned brighter than ever, a beacon that seemed to pulse with William's trapped essence. Elias dragged himself to his feet, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and grief. He gathered up the journals and the crystal, evidence of Cornelius Pemberton's crime and William's continuing imprisonment. Then he stumbled to the opening in the wall and climbed through, leaving the sealed room and its impossible lantern behind. He should have sealed the wall again immediately. That would have been the rational thing to do, the safe thing. But Elias couldn't bring himself to brick up that opening, to make William's prison even more complete. The boy had saved him, had chosen continued torment to protect people he had never met, and the least Elias could do was leave a window, however small, between William's prison and the world he had lost. Elias returned to his cabin and sat awake until dawn. The journal spread before him, trying to understand everything he had learned. The truth was almost too much to bear. William Pemberton had been trapped for 30 years, was still trapped, would remain trapped perhaps forever, all because his father's arrogance and obsession had led him to meddle with forces beyond human comprehension. And now Elias carried the knowledge of this ongoing tragedy, unable to free the boy, unable to tell anyone what he knew, unable to do anything except bear witness to an injustice that transcended normal human experience. As the sun rose on the morning of November 1st, 1845, Elias made a decision. He would continue his work in the attic, would maintain his access to that sealed room, and would keep watch over William's prison. Perhaps someday he would find a way to bring the boy back without unleashing those other things that waited in the liminal spaces. Perhaps, given enough time and study, he could understand what Cornelius had done well enough to undo it safely. But even as he made this resolution, Elias felt a creeping unease. His experience in that in-between space had changed him in ways he didn't fully understand. He could feel the pull of that liminal realm even now, a constant tug at the edges of his consciousness. The boundary between himself and that impossible place had been blurred, and he wasn't certain it could ever be fully restored. Over the following days, he tried to resume his normal routines, but he found it increasingly difficult. His mind kept wandering, losing track of time and place. He would be shelving books in the attic and suddenly realize he was standing before the sealed wall with no memory of having walked there. At night, he dreamed of being in two places at once, his body in his cabin while his consciousness drifted through that space where William waited. Solomon noticed the change in him. The old man approached Elias one evening as he was returning from the main house. "You went in there, didn't you?" Solomon asked quietly. "Into that sealed room." Elias considered lying but found he didn't have the energy. He nodded. "And what did you find?" "The truth about William Pemberton," Elias said, "and about his father, and about things that shouldn't exist but do anyway." Solomon's expression was grave. "You need to stay away from there now. Whatever you found, whatever you learned, it ain't worth your life or your sanity. I seen men go down this path before, getting obsessed with things that ought to be left alone. It never ends well." "A boy is trapped," Elias said. "He's been trapped for 30 years. How can I just walk away from that?" "Because you can't help him," Solomon replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "Whatever happened in that room, whatever magic or curse or devil's work it was, it's beyond what any of us can fix. Best you can do is seal it back up and try to forget what you saw." But Elias couldn't forget. In the days and weeks that followed, he found himself drawn back to the sealed room again and again. He would climb through the opening in the wall and sit in the dusty space, keeping vigil by the eternally burning lantern. Sometimes he thought he could see William in the shadows, a translucent figure watching him with sad eyes. Other times he felt he was being observed by those other presences, the hungry things that waited for any chance to cross over into the world of flesh and time. Master Harrison's health continued to decline. By mid-November, it was clear that the old man was dying. He spent his final days in a morphine haze, occasionally murmuring words that no one could understand. Elias wondered if Harrison knew anything about what his father had done, if the family history included whispered stories about Cornelius's occult interests. But if such knowledge existed, it died with Harrison on November 19th, 1845. The estate fell into a period of mourning, and in the chaos of funeral preparations and the settling of the will, Elias was largely forgotten. He used this freedom to spend even more time in the sealed room, studying Cornelius's journals, trying to piece together a solution to William's imprisonment. He learned rudimentary principles of the magical system Cornelius had used, though much of it seemed arbitrary and founded on assumptions that might or might not be valid. One thing became clear through his studies. The lantern itself was the key. It was not just an ordinary lamp, but had been specially prepared by Cornelius for use in the translocation ritual. The oil was mixed with substances that Elias didn't recognize, and the flame, once lit during the working, had become a kind of anchor point for the rupture between worlds. As long as it burned, the connection between the real world and that liminal space remained open. But extinguishing it might have consequences even worse than leaving it lit. potentially stranding William completely beyond reach. As December arrived and the year drew toward its close, Elias felt himself changing in fundamental ways. His body seemed lighter, less substantial, as if he were slowly becoming translucent like William. He had difficulty maintaining focus on physical tasks, his hands passing through objects occasionally before he could grasp them properly. Solomon's warnings had been prophetic. Elias was being pulled into that in-between space drawn by his repeated exposure to the sealed room's energies. He knew he should stop visiting the room, should distance himself from William's prison before he became another victim. But he couldn't abandon the boy, couldn't leave him alone in that terrible isolation. And so Elias continued his vigil, sitting by the burning lantern night after night, keeping William company across the barrier between worlds. On the night of December 15, 1845, something changed. Elias was in the sealed room sitting at the desk with one of Cornelius's journals open before him when he became aware that William was trying to communicate. The boy's translucent form appeared in the shadows and his voice came through more clearly than it ever had before. "You're fading," William said, his tone urgent. "I can see it happening. You're doing what I did, but slower. If you keep coming here, you'll end up trapped like me." "I know," Elias admitted, "but I can't just abandon you." "You have to," William insisted. "This is my prison, my father's sin. You don't need to share it. Go back to your life, forget about me, seal that wall up properly, and never think about this place again." "I won't do that," Elias said firmly. "Not while there's any chance I can help you." William's translucent face showed a mixture of gratitude and despair. "Then we need to try something desperate. There might be a way to close the rupture from my side, to seal it permanently so nothing can cross either way. It would mean I could never leave, would never have any connection to the real world again. But it might also free you from this pull you're feeling. The connection would be severed completely." Elias felt a chill settle over him. "How would you do this?" "The lantern is the anchor," William explained, his words coming quickly as if he feared losing the ability to speak. "It exists partly in both worlds, keeping the rupture open. If I can shatter it from my side, break it so it can never burn again, the connection should collapse. But I'll need your help. I'll need you to touch both the lantern and the crystal at the same moment I strike the blow. Your presence will give me enough solid connection to affect the physical lantern. And if this works, you'll be completely cut off," Elias said, understanding the full horror of what William was proposing. "You'll be alone forever with no hope of ever being rescued." "I'm alone now," William replied. "At least this way I'll know I saved someone else from the same fate, and maybe in time I'll simply dissolve into this place, become part of it instead of being trapped within it. That might be better than remaining conscious and isolated for eternity." Elias wanted to refuse, wanted to argue that there had to be another way, but he recognized the wisdom in William's proposal. The boy had endured 30 years of imprisonment and had gained insights into the nature of his prison that Elias, for all his study, could never match. If William believed this was the only solution, then it probably was. "When do we do this?" Elias asked. "Now," William said, "before either of us loses our courage." Elias stood and positioned himself at the desk. He placed one hand on the lantern's brass base and the other on the crystal. The familiar surge of energy flowed through him, and he felt reality beginning to thin and shift. He could see William clearly now, the boy standing just on the other side of that impossible barrier, holding what appeared to be a heavy stone from the liminal version of the room. "Thank you," William said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for trying to help me. Thank you for not forgetting I was here." Then he raised the stone and brought it down on the version of the lantern that existed in his prison. The impact rippled across both realities. Elias saw the glass chimney of the physical lantern crack, saw the flame gutter and flare wildly. William struck again and again, each blow sending shockwaves through the fabric of space itself. The room around Elias began to shake, and he could feel the rupture starting to collapse. The other presences, those hungry things that had waited so long for a chance to cross over, seemed to realize what was happening. They surged forward, trying to force their way through before the connection was severed completely. Elias caught glimpses of them, forms that hurt to look at, geometries that didn't belong in any sane universe. They pressed against the barrier, and for a terrible moment he thought they might succeed in breaking through. But William stood between them and the opening, his translucent form becoming a shield. The boy had spent 30 years in that liminal space, and he had learned to exist within it in ways that gave him strength there. He held the line while continuing to batter at the lantern with his stone, each impact further destabilizing the rupture. The physical lantern shattered, glass and brass flew apart, and the flame, which had burned for more than 2 months without fuel, finally extinguished. The rupture collapsed with a sound like thunder, and Elias was thrown backward once again, the force of the closure hitting him like a physical wave. He tumbled across the dusty floor, coming to rest against the far wall, every bone in his body aching. When he managed to get to his feet and look at the desk, he saw that the lantern was gone, not just broken but utterly destroyed, reduced to fragments so small they might have been dust. The crystal had cracked into dozens of pieces, and even Cornelius's journals had been affected, their pages crumbling into ash as if they had aged centuries in an instant. The room felt different now. The oppressive weight that had always hung in the air was gone, replaced by simple emptiness. There was no sense of being watched, no feeling of presences lurking in the shadows. The rupture had been sealed completely, and everything connected to it had been destroyed by the force of its closure, including, Elias realized with a grief that threatened to overwhelm him, any hope of ever reaching William again. The boy had sacrificed himself completely, had chosen eternal isolation in that impossible space to ensure that neither Elias nor anyone else would be drawn into his fate. It was an act of heroism that no one would ever know about, a selfless deed that would never be recorded or remembered. Elias gathered up the remains of the journals, though there was little left that could be read. He climbed through the opening in the wall one final time, and then he did what he should have done weeks ago. He sealed the breach completely, using all his skill to ensure that the brickwork was solid and permanent. No one would ever enter that room again, not in his lifetime, perhaps not ever. As he worked, he wept, tears running down his face to mix with the mortar. He wept for William, trapped forever in a space between spaces. He wept for the cruelty of Cornelius Pemberton, who had valued magical knowledge more than his own son's life. He wept for himself, for the weight of knowledge he would carry for the rest of his days, for the truth he could never share and the friend he had made and lost across the boundary between worlds. When the wall was complete, Elias stepped back and looked at his work. It was solid and strong, and it showed no sign of the opening that had existed there. To any casual observer, this was simply a wall, unmarked and unremarkable. Only Elias knew what lay beyond it. Only he understood what terrible price had been paid in that sealed space. Over the following months, as winter gave way to spring and 1846 began, life at the Pemberton estate returned to a kind of normalcy. Harrison's widow sold the property to a family from Charleston, and most of the enslaved people, including Elias, were sold to new owners as part of the transaction. Elias found himself working in a warehouse near the docks, a position that required his literacy but offered none of the relative freedom he had enjoyed in the Pemberton attic. He never returned to the manor, never saw the sealed room again. But he carried the memory of it with him always, carried the knowledge of William Pemberton's sacrifice and the truth about what had happened on November 3rd, 1815. In the years that followed, he would sometimes tell pieces of the story to people he trusted, though he always presented it as a legend or a ghost tale rather than something he had experienced personally. The Pemberton house stood for another 20 years before being destroyed in a fire in 1866 during the chaos following the Civil War. The official records indicated that the fire was accidental, started by a vagrant who had taken shelter in the abandoned building. But there were rumors whispered among the people who had once been enslaved there that the fire had started in the attic, in a section of the eastern wing where no vagrant could have gained access. Some said they saw a blue light glowing from the windows before the flames began, a light that looked like a lantern burning where no lantern should be. Whether these rumors were true, whether William Pemberton had somehow found a way to make his presence known one final time, Elias never learned. By 1866, he was an old man, living free in Massachusetts, working as a teacher for children whose parents had once been enslaved. He heard about the fire from a letter sent by someone who had known him in his Savannah days, and he spent a long time sitting in silence after reading the news. That night he dreamed of the sealed room. In his dream he stood once again by the desk, and the old lantern burned with its impossible flame. William appeared beside him, no longer translucent but solid and real, smiling with a peace that Elias had never seen in the boy's face during their brief acquaintance. "Thank you for remembering," William said in the dream. "Thank you for caring enough to try." "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," Elias replied, the words he had wanted to say for more than 20 years finally finding voice. "You saved yourself," William said, "and you bore witness to what happened, carried the truth forward so that my fate wouldn't be completely forgotten. That's more than I ever hoped for." The dream faded, and Elias woke with tears on his face and a strange lightness in his chest, as if some burden he had carried for decades had finally been lifted. He never dreamed of the sealed room again, and as he moved through his final years, he found a kind of peace with the memory of those terrible events in 1845. When Elias died in 1873, he was surrounded by family, people who had once been enslaved and were now free, living lives that would have been impossible in the world of his youth. As his consciousness faded for the final time, he thought he saw a boy standing in the corner of the room, 9 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes, smiling at him with gratitude and farewell. The story of the Pemberton house and its sealed room became a local legend in Savannah, one of dozens of ghost tales that the old families would tell to entertain visitors and frighten children. Most of the details were wrong, corrupted by decades of retelling, and no one remembered the name of the enslaved man who had uncovered the truth. But the core of the tale remained: a room sealed by tragedy, a lantern that burned where no lantern should be, and a boy lost between worlds, waiting for a rescue that would never come. And on certain nights, when the conditions were right and the boundary between spaces grew thin, people walking past the ruins of the old Pemberton property would swear they saw a blue light glowing from where the attic windows used to be. A light like a lantern flame, burning steadily in a room that no longer existed, tended by a boy who had learned to make a home in impossible spaces, waiting patiently for someone to remember that he was there.